experience. I know that's going to be very applicable to AI. So Sarala, I'd love to get your perspective here because I know that you live AI every single day in scaled operations. How do you think about quality given the volumes that are now coming your way?
That's actually a very interesting question, Richard. I think I would start by saying managing quality at the speed with which we operate is literally like non-negotiable, right? And that's paramount. And the way to look at it is we need to make that happen. The move has to be from reactive checks to proactive calibrations. And if you were to actually take a step from there, as volumes move up, one of the things to also look at is the focus needs to shift more towards how do we build architectures that are more resilient, and that can be supported with two very key and important levers. I think the first one is more around how do you do intelligent sampling. And the second one, very, very critical and very close to that, is that needs to be supported well with automated evaluation frameworks. Now, these two put together will actually give us the kind of outcomes that we're looking at, right? And here is where I would say that this particular structure enables us to keep giving outcomes and outputs that works like a literal system, right? And you are able to pull humans then at the right space, right time, because the expertise that humans bring, the specialization, is very, very powerful. And that's where you have the whole verify, trust and verify. That model needs to come in and kick in there. So I think the way to look at this overall is it's not about matching or keeping pace with the speed, but it's what's more important is as speed picks up, how do you make sure that's enabling us to keep creating data that we really, really need? That's going to be very foundational and fundamental to how we operate and how good that golden data set is. So that's the way I would look at the overall ecosystem.
I like it. Now, Anish, you've seen this from the highest levels. How do you approach challenges like this?
To set the stage, in the United States, digital platforms have largely been governed under a provision of our law called Section 230.
and create these closed loops. So you're continuously using operations not as a back end for just delivering work and checking the box that we've done enforcement, but really to feed the machine and start to think about how are we driving better products? How are we driving better policy? Ultimately, how are we driving better user outcomes?
I guess increasingly today, as folks implement AI, it's, how do you design this airplane as we're trying to fly it and go through that transformation? So I'd love to get your take. What does AI first actually mean for established companies? Again, this is something that I know you're living through.
This is something that I keep talking to anybody who's passionate about the space, right? Actually, AI first is a mindset shift. And that mindset shift is to be curious and to also be open to a lot of experimentation. And it requires that motivation. If I were to look at three large parts to this, the first one is, as we empower our teams to start using a lot of AI tools, they should start looking at it as an enabler. They should also start looking at it as a way that has a multiplier effect. And the moment that realization comes through, there is automatically that shift in mindset that will come. So that's the first pillar, I would say, is AI first is all about the mindset. The second is skill set. As you move into this space, it's critical to understand that foundational to this work is going to be the business acumen. And you can use a lot of synonyms to this. It could be subject matter expert, it could be domain expert, it could be workflow expert, but finally we're looking at somebody who has that skill set, and it has to be a good balance between domain knowledge and technical skill sets. So that will be the second one. And I think third, very critical, is as you have the mindset, as you have a skill set, how open are you to the shift? And the shift is you move away from being operational to being transformational, to be somebody who is orchestrating, right? And who is also in a space to build and set up the architects. So to me, these are the three key pillars to be AI first: the mindset, the skill set, and the shift to be an architect.
So Aneesh, I bet you've seen a lot here where companies have been preparing for new regulation, or if they're trying to transform themselves, but then you've got the EUA Act or something like this. How do you get that right skill set in-house? Are they just trying their best, or again, what do you see works given your experience?
Well, the current state is almost a false choice that we've imposed as a society. We either express through policy a desire not to have adverse effects and create blunt instruments that, frankly, kick the can to courts to decide whether your regulation interpreted by one implementer is meeting the rule or not. And that's sort of a tough world to be in, where not a lot of certainty in the world when you've got, kind of a rigid regulatory framework. Or you say nothing and you leave it to the market to kind of figure out, which, obviously people have a perspective about the challenges that we've seen there. I view this as a third path, and it's ultimately about the lack of consensus on standards. And so AI creates an opportunity to close some of these gaps. What I mean by that is part of the reason different countries have different regulatory regimes is the frustration is high everywhere, and then the willingness to do something, that's unique to each political environment. But if we solved the underlying problem, if we reduced the amount of harm on these platforms, and we increased societal good, reduce the false positive, reduce the false negative, naturally, as a sector, this would be seen as a good, this thing is moving. As I mentioned, Section 230 originally dreamed, hey, we'll give you the liability shield, but you got to, proactively engage in solving problems. And so that creates a third way. And the third way, and we wrote an executive order on this that still holds to this day on how new technologies should be regulated in the Obama years. And we basically said, let's Obviously, we need to have capacity improvement inside the government. So there is a little bit of back to skill set, mindset for the companies. Same thing has to apply to government. But you can't rely on that because this is a difficult skill set to learn. So yes, you have to get better, but you also want to encourage, maybe even demand, industry collaboration to set these guardrails. So when you get there, now the question is, most of these policies are words on a page. And Sarala may interpret the words one way and run her team to execute. I may interpret them a different way. And so who's right? One of the interesting things in the era of AI is we can now start to expose reasoning APIs, where you can actually get to consensus, computational, what you'll call layer 2 consensus on what the interpretation of the paper should be. So you could bring scenarios. If this image is not supposed to be presented against this image based on these policies, here's an objective reasoning to explain why, and then we can argue whether we agree or disagree with that reasoning. This AI first mindset that you asked Sarala introduces a new concept of almost regulatory product innovation, essentially. Could we in advance almost prevent the ad showing up in the wrong way by having that reasoning appear before a stated harm is identified? Could you fast track, like we were talking about TSA PreCheck? Could you submit an ad online and have it reason against policy and give feedback before you even hit publish? And that type of capability. These reasoning APIs are a new concept that could introduce more tools to reduce the outcome harms that we're worried about. And so with my mindset on AI first is, what's the North Star problem to solve? We want to minimize adverse effects where possible. And society has kind of roughly explained what those topic categories are. Okay, so now can we use AI to help address more of that on the front end and to get more industry consensus? I remain a fan of community notes as almost a crowdsourced model where there's been kind of like, reasoning by human expertise, collated. And now AI may introduce a version of that is sort of like against these, global norms. This thing should not have been identified, or flag if you think it should or shouldn't. So anyway, I think you want to embrace these new technologies to solve the problems as much as you want to use them to make your staff more effective and efficient.
I love the idea of PreCheck. Rahul, I know you work with a lot of different companies, especially as they expand into international markets. Is there an emerging PreCheck standard coming out there for everywhere they're going, or do they still have to do everything manually?
I think that the idea of the standard and mindset is so important here. I couldn't amplify those points more. I think the past 5 to 10 years showed us that companies in the age of content moderation went down it their own way, enforced in their own way, but that doesn't work in the age of AI. As you evaluate models, as you evaluate integrations, and you really think about what is the impact that AI is having on users and on populations, the volume of workflows, the volume of issues that are hitting teams, the complexity of those issues, novel new use cases that need to be defined, understood, and then enforced at scale. It's so significant that we need more standards. We need more of an idea of really how do we work as an industry to understand that idea of a PreCheck. How do we have common standards for what is and isn't acceptable? In the past, we had things like, we still have NCMEC. NCMEC is a great example of the industry working together and really thinking about how do we prevent child harms. I think as novel and new issues emerge, companies really need to start to work together to create shared understanding using things like community notes, community forums, which has been a really big project we've been pursuing with one of our platform clients to understand for niche specific populations, how do they interact with their AI? What are the use cases that are emerging? And how do we really train the models to exist in those contexts so that we don't overgeneralize, but we can meet the needs of a specific population while still having a standard that we operate against?
All right, I'm very optimistic about this, just generally at heart, but given the complexities are increasing, the volumes continue to go up exponentially, especially AI-generated content. I feel like these tools, we can use them to compound on each other, but the title of our session here is Operating Models for AI and Safety. So Sarala, I'd love to get your take. What does the operating model of the future look like? What glimpse can you give us?
I'll probably keep it very simple because I think in this context, simple is very powerful. I think the way I see the future is it's going to be specialized teams that will be augmented by agents, and they will absolutely need a lot of policy and model evals handy. And that, the combination of those three is what the future looks like.
Very interesting. Rahul, I'd love to get your take on that as well, because I know this is something you focus on quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that in the future, you're going to start to see this concept of small, mighty teams really start to emerge. You're going to start to see that really the reliance on large, complex organizations to create safety, to create protections for users and how they operate, that'll start to evaporate. You'll start to see the role of agentic play a larger and larger role in really driving operations, enforcement, guardrails for platforms. And those agents will then be augmented by the idea of these small, mighty teams, really specialists and niche skill sets that come in to operate the way in which the agent delivers an outcome, and the way in which you're ultimately affecting your operations and driving better model use, better model design, and better user outcomes. Again, I think all of that's amplified by the idea of better standards across the industry for what we do, how we do it, and then that idea that you can go deeper into niche populations, understand their needs, but roll that back up to the enterprise and the way the larger product operates.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, going right along with the idea of, getting transparency, building consensus across industry, again, to these standards, we already have these benchmark evals that try to track performance so we can see whose model is better. I think that there's an emerging need out here to also create these standards, or rather these evals that can show, hey, look, there may not be a perfectly right answer, but you can find a current best answer. And then try to build consensus around that. But again, Aneesh, I know that this is also a space that you've been working on and have a good perspective on.
I think the flywheel that we're hearing from Sarala and Rahul is you've got, clearly an abundant world where AI agents can allow you to create these niche expertise teams. You can do your job better. I love the simplicity framework. But now let's close that loop. So let's assume we want to label AI generated content to make sure people understand what it is or it isn't. Door one, no standards. So Sarala's team has to figure that out internally. And yes, she could deploy AI agents to try to reverse engineer whether or not something looks like it was AI generated. And that takes effort. And let's assume there's an error rate tied to that effort. Now let's imagine door number two. Hi, Deepa. Door number two, let's ask the flip question. What if the industry reached consensus on how to watermark AI-generated content, no matter where it was published? So the key creativity outlets, the publishing arms that generate AI-generated content, agree to a watermark. Now you've reduced the complexity in the operating model, because now you're flagging for something that's already been agreed upon by industry standard. And oh, by the way, if it turns out something fell through the cracks, and this is an important point I want to highlight, industry standards work when there's enforceability on the behavior. And just to give you some context on the United States, if you promise your customers that you will give them a watermarked AI-generated output, and that is stated in your objectives as a business, I will give you AI-generated content, and by the way, I will meet the standard for watermarking. And it turns out that was used in an ad that Sarala's team never saw the watermark, and it made it through. Who's at fault? The publisher of the AI content that did not add the watermark when they committed to doing so would hold liability for effectively misleading their customers that they were offering a service that didn't do it. So it starts to create, you can create more in a fragmented, very dynamic market economy. You can start to see pieces and parts come together. And let's say in that same flywheel, the teams that Sarala has and the agents running figure out oh, by the way, there's a new trend emerging. There's this new audio thing that wasn't even envisioned in the watermark, and we got to figure out a way to identify that. That can be flagged as recommendations to get industry consensus for future norms that then could be hardwired, and then the loop closes. So you sort of have to have two operating models inside the enterprise, which I think is exactly what Rahul and Sarala have described, and then one that has dependencies on how external stakeholders engage that reduce the burden on the internal models. And if you do both of those right, not easy, then I think we get more of the good from all of these investments and less of the bad.
So Rahul, as you work with your clients, they're reskilling, they're investing in whatever they need to from an IT perspective. They're also building up their skills, but they need an entire new ecosystem of vendors to work with. What have you seen here?
So I think the ideas that we're describing here, they're wonderful. This is like exactly the approach that the industry needs to move towards. The challenge is the models that exist today are so entrenched. Behaviors are so entrenched. Silos exist. Policy complexity exists. Shifting the org in that direction, this is a multi-year, sometimes 3 to 5 year journey for platforms and just Fortune 500s to really think about how do we shift towards this AI first mindset. This is something that I can see just working with my own clients. This isn't something that'll happen this year or next year, but that process is incredibly gradual. And so what we're starting to observe more and more is this shift from really how do we do work, and that idea of small and mighty teams, right? Highly specialized niche skill sets augmented by AI. While that sounds wonderful today, that's a vision that's really going to take shape over 2 or 3 years. But we're starting to see that shift towards higher volumes, more regulated markets, more complexity, more novel use cases emerging. You're having to see that we're shifting from generalized service providers who enforce at scale to now a long tail of skill sets and suppliers coming into the mix. And these skill sets really augmenting now a novel set of harms that we don't really understand. There is no industry consensus on really trying to understand what those mean and drive enforcement or operations or evals against that. But that shift, again, it's a multi-year process to get to this point.
Well, and a lot of stakeholders to engage there too,
Yes.
to get all the details right. Again, Aneesh, I know that you've been have a lot of experience bringing everybody to the table, making sure they all get a fair piece of the pie. That's my first question: is how do you accomplish that practically and efficiently? But then the second question I have for you is, as companies try to do the right thing here, sometimes they do need outside help. I'm a consultant, so I can say that. But what benefit does that bring, and more importantly, what's the risk if they don't?
Well, I'd certainly defer to Sarala on the context of how to get expertise in the right location to execute a plan. I think that's a very critical. In a world with changing policies and objectives, you kind of need to have agile teams to support. I think that's a given. Leadership matters, and so let me draw this scenario about transparency. I think Sarala, you may have mentioned some of this, and Rahul did on some of the reports. I'm a healthcare guy in the current state, so let's use that as an example. OpenAI has been transparent that people are basically uploading screenshots of their medical records into OpenAI, and I think it's like double-digit share of OpenAI queries are very health related. And people are willing to upload very sensitive, protected health information. Now, this is not CSAM and harm. This is like my personal medical records. And people are uploading them into ChatGPT and sharing all of the benefits that they're getting from understanding it. And also Gemini, I'm respectful of all the platforms. So here's the question. When this report is released about the reality that there's all of this activity, now there's no government regulation globally that answers this question cleanly. Is this a harmful activity or not? I think intuitively you would say, gosh, you want the platforms to be careful not to make sure that that information is misused or have ads run against it. Sarala, back to this. I put up my health records, and all of a sudden I've got ads running that describe my health condition. That may freak people out. So the leadership moment was in the United States. The president, now when the president of any party, President Obama, President Bush, President Trump, all three used their role to explicitly talk about the need to get more health information into the hands of consumers. And as President Obama said, to allow them to connect it to the tools and services that can help them make sense of it. It takes leadership to say, I want to create a whole new framework. And so July of last year, I'm with Rahul. These things can take years because of the level of complexity, but sometimes leadership cuts that faster. You could fast track some of the years. So Trump basically said, I want healthcare to move at a fast pace, but I want you to bring responsibility and here's a framework. And I want your commitment that you're going to implement this framework. So he didn't wait for the industry to come up with a framework. So here's my framework, published in July. Within 6 months, ChatGPT for Health and Claude for Healthcare launched, where they basically embodied all of the principles that were outlined by the government and shipped a product that now creates a separate data store for your health records that almost looks like it's HIPAA protected without being HIPAA protected. Now, that was a policy change that the platforms adopted in response to a leadership call to action on a consensus approach where they could iterate as to how they, Claude took a little bit of a different answer than ChatGPT, and we're waiting for Google. I think by April, we're going to see Google, Apple, and Microsoft and Samsung, honor their commitments, which were all publicly stated in July. So this notion of pace of change and the need to address complexity, the elephant in the room is when there's leadership, you can almost fast pass your way through some of these issues and just shift the dynamics so that you can ship in days and weeks what otherwise would take months or years.
In our discussion here, there's a word that I haven't yet heard, but I think is really critical as we talk about governance and all the change that's happening, and that's accountability. Sarala, I'd love to get your take on this one too. So what roles do humans play to ensure this quality and accountability? What new models are you seeing as they actually try to do this? Because someone's got to look at it.
Yeah, I think humans, their expertise, and how we evolve that over a period of time will be paramount. And over a period of time, you would see the way humans are in the loop, engage in the loop, and are also auditing it. They are not just executing, but they're also directing it, right? And more importantly, they are reviewing this whole output. That, I think, is critical. And over a period of time, we need to start doubling down on that human expertise, and how much and where do we bring humans in the loop, and tap on that expertise. And it goes back to the conversation that we had earlier, that domain knowledge is like a given. Business acumen, domain knowledge, super critical. Overlay that with tech skill sets. That's actually the package that's required.
Rahul, I know, again, you work with a bunch of clients across domains too. I'd love to get your take on this, given that, you can take some experience in one area and try to cross-pollinate or transplant it. Again, I'd love to know what you've seen.
Yeah, on the idea of accountability, and I think on the idea of leadership, there's two things that come to mind. I do think that leadership, especially from the top and from our elected officials, from regulators, I think it's critical. I think setting a standard, setting a vision, it gives the industry a direction to move into. We saw this, for example, with DSA, right? The European Commission announced this is the standard, this is how companies are expected to operate, and we saw the platforms move in that direction. The version of implementation varied at each. The quality of implementation, as shown in transparency reports, varied at each. And so while we can get the industry to start moving in a direction, ultimately on the shareholder value side, driving excellence in the way in which that vision is ultimately executed with efficiency, with quality, that can take time, but that comes once that vision exists. And I think as industry consensus starts to build on what that looks like. From my vantage point as a strategy and operations consultant, I really think I have a preference for the operations teams. And I really think about the importance that operations teams play in creating accountability and quality. I think a lot of the buzz, a lot of the hype exists in policy and upstream, very important, sets the foundation for what ultimately happens. But if operations teams really work well and are embedded in that mindset of the small, mighty team, integrated back into policy and really thinking about what are we observing, what are we learning from our users, what are we able to feed back to our policy, research, product team so they can go and do external research and understand externally what do our users need, that creates that accountability loop that drives better user outcomes and better performance for the platform.
Very cool. I think that's, again, great insight, very, very micro. I'd love to get the macro perspective because, Aneesh, you've negotiated a lot of these big picture items here. What was that like?
Well, when there's motivation to reach consensus because you want to move forward, people are willing to collaborate. I remember at the end of the Biden administration, there had been an initial regulation in electronic health records to create more transparency and governance obligations when you implement AI in a physician's electronic health record. But it left to the industry a lot of the specific details as to how they would go about it. And so sometimes, like, Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, right? So you have a scenario where maybe in DSA would be another example, where you feel like you've got a very strict detail as to what you have to accomplish. It creates that variability that Rahul outlined. That it may not be great. You want to have, consistency and high quality. If you do nothing, then they don't move at all, so you don't get much. It's molasses. So the Goldilocks, what we did is the day the Biden team finalized the regulation on the need to have transparency and governance in AI models that are running in a physician's electronic health record. That day, I helped recruit about 25 health organizations, large health systems and health plans, who published essentially a commitments document that was essentially an enforceable code of conduct to say, what we're going to do is we're going to watermark, we're going to create, so we're going to explain to doctors and consumers. As a small example, if you emailed your doctor today, there's a reasonable chance that the doctor's response to your message has been generated by AI. And there was no industry consensus that you had to disclose that. Because people said, oh, it's like spell check. It's like a tool. I don't say this email was written with the help of spell check. That maybe feels weird. But there was a sense that, and the University of California, San Diego said, in our experience, we ran it and we did an experiment, and patients actually valued the disclosure that the message was partially automated and reviewed by Dr. X. That was the watermark. And when they shared that with our working group, everybody said, hey, that's a good idea. We should agree to do that. And so that became one of the commitments that was published at the same time. So look, to Rahul's point, when a leader does create a direction and people move, the second step is there a vehicle to get consensus on how to move effectively and efficiently? And that's what we did with the healthcareaicommitments.com project, was to get consensus. And that has grown. I think 50 or so organizations have adopted it. And the premise is yin and yang have to be in place. And you want Sarala and her team, as she was sharing, as they get to this feedback loop of simplicity, that maybe they can interact with these stakeholder vehicles to say, this isn't working on the ground. We're getting negative consumer feedback on the watermark. Maybe we should think about that in a different way. If you don't have that feedback loop, you've ossified the operations. So anyway, I think that's why it's possible when you have leadership to execute things that are not natural for people to do, which is to come together in a competitive market to do something in a collaborative way.
Okay, so we've got the top-down mandate from the boss. Rahul, you've designed a bunch of these operating models. What have you seen? What works? What doesn't work? And with all the experimentation going on, again, I'd love to get your perspective on how quality is increasing and the pitfalls along the way.
Yeah, happy to. Building on Aneesh's idea, I love that, right? The idea comes from the top. Someone sets the vision, the government, a regulator, whoever it is. I think one of the pitfalls that these types of governance models can run into is that after that, you see kind of a middle tier of organizations trying to affect really what implementation looks like. I think after Aneesh's point on set the vision, start to set standards, you really need to see the industry leaders, the CEOs, the top executives being a layer of governance to continue to shape that mandate, to hold their teams accountable, so that when the middle starts working on this actual execution and its implementation, they're subject to what their leaders, their CEOs, their CXOs actually have in mind, and those CXOs continue to sustain the momentum of how that's actually effective. I think within organizations, it again comes back to this idea that you create these closed loops. You have really well-defined processes, not opposed to the idea of being agile or nimble or aligned to the idea of agentic in this age of AI, but this idea of structure in terms of like, how do we really build? What are we building? And you design the right mix of controls that don't create friction, but create the right levels of accountability along the way, so that as you're releasing models, as you're building new systems, as you're building new tools, running operations, you're actually able to feed meaningful insight back into your teams, who then go execute and action items. I think the pitfall of a lot of organizations with their governance is they run in these linear processes where there is no end or there is no outcome that's ultimately measured or delivered. Creating that continuous loop is, in my view, what makes these governance models effective.
Okay, so we've gotten the mandate from the boss. we've got our operating model, but we need to reskill our people. Again, Sarla, I know that one of your passions is making sure that your team is very well supported and that they're well equipped for the future. What skills do you see as being more valuable going forward?
I think I'll continue to double down on expertise, right? Because I keep my teams true to that. So I'm going to continue sharing that. I think in addition to expertise, what is also required is sometimes being open to how the ecosystem is changing and adapting to that. And I feel the more we do that, the 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 transformations will be clearer, and I think partnerships will be far more stronger. So I think the skill set will be have very good strong foundation of the domain that you're in. Be very observant of how the ecosystem is changing to learn, be agile, and then partner to spread that the best of the learnings that you have had.
Aneesh, I'd love to get your perspective as well. You know, as you see all these skills, or as people trying to experiment and develop their own skill sets, you know, what advice, I guess, would you give to everybody out there who's maybe a little AI anxious?
Well, I mean, scale, the challenge is at the scale. You can have the expertise in given areas, but when the volumes just become so vast, there is a societal question about how does one shift the labor market, education supply to be more responsive to these needs. This has been a challenge in education for many, many, many years. And maybe there's a internal Google center of excellence that keeps the expertise, you know, humming. Maybe there's an educational ecosystem that's, you know, government or university funded that supports not just Google, but others to kind of get that talent organized. This is one of the conundrums in the AI moment, which is that to some degree, there's a perception that we're going to see significant job losses. And again, in healthcare, radiology was supposed to be eliminated years ago with AI. And yet radiologist openings have exceeded more than in history. Yeah. So I don't know this concept of expertise and scale. When we bring in AI tools, maybe there is a new equilibrium where we actually get far better output from the investments in human capital, expertise that's supplemented by the agentic workflows. Rahul, I think you highlighted that very nicely. Maybe there is a path forward that looks like on the margin, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have the expertise at scale, powered by some of these tools that support, but we still have aggregate labor participation in ways that just generate, you know, double-digit economic growth. Maybe that's the equilibrium we're going to find as we, you know, wrap up this week's AI summit, that we'll see hope and optimism exceed some of the concerns others may have that this circle doesn't square. So maybe we can square this circle and get the expertise that Sarala is describing, powered by some of the agent plus human interactions that Rahul described. So put these two together and make magic happen.
I think, this is a good segue. I also think it's very important for us to recognize that switching contexts in this ever adapting and evolving AI tools, the ability for anybody to understand and switch contexts in the space that they're working is also going to be very, very important and critical. So, and that comes as a part of what we feel is an expertise.
Speaking of switching contexts again, Rahul, I know you work with a lot of different clients here, and again, I'm very optimistic now. Productivity, I think, is the word that we're going for here. I'd love to get your perspective on what you're seeing your teams produce. Are we seeing like a 2x fold in how fast PowerPoints can be produced? No, I'm kidding, but yeah,
I wish. No, I don't know that we're seeing that yet. I think what we're seeing is, I think we're seeing probably two things. I think we're seeing still a lot of hype and a lot of anticipation around what AI is doing. And then I think you see the use of AI as a way to maybe game insights and game the delivery of something. My advice to what I affectionately call the young people is think about how you really build context and judgment, because value in your career, value for all of us will exist in context and judgment, supplemented by AI. And I think one of the key things for us to keep doing as leaders is to really keep training that next generation, and for that generation to train the next generation on context and judgment, to really understand how is work delivered, how is a model built, how is financial analysis done, how is a research report written, what is meaningful insight, and not just rely on the AI to do that, because we need to really be able to understand how to deploy AI and use it and treat it as an augmentation versus as a replacement for us in some dystopian universe where AI serves AI in the form of products and services. I don't think we're going to get there. I think it's really how do we continue to generate context and judgment for ourselves.
Yeah, no, I'm relieved. I don't want to be replaced by Grok, but yeah, I think we'll be all right. I see we only have a couple minutes left, but if there are any questions from the audience, again, I want to make sure that there's time for folks to ask any. But yeah, I see a couple of hands here. I don't know if there are microphones. Yeah.
I can hear you. Yeah, why don't you come up if you can hear us?
Yeah, thanks very much. Excellent panel. Thanks for the discussion. This is really a question, really a waterfall, as it were, maybe ending in Aneesh, right? Rahul, just foot stomping on a lot of the things. I hear there were standards a lot, right? And we're in the middle of the world's most populous country, largest democracy, right? It's open. And so open societies run and get to standards at a slower rate in general than more autocratic top-down, right? Because the risk of being top-down, and Anish kind of touched on this, is you can be efficient, but you could be wrong, and that's deleterious to the industry, et cetera. How might we be able to develop these standards, right? And then there's also the issue of, even in open societies like in the US, you have ANSI versus ISO versus IEEE, like my standards are better than yours. I was wanting to see what that is. Maybe start with Sarala on what do you want as the ultimate user of a standard, right? And then Rahul, what you see in the sector, and Anish, how can we get there because you've had that leadership role? Thank you.
You know, in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis, what we look at is what's the ecosystem like? How is it evolving? How are the needs and customers from both customers and users evolving? And therefore working backwards, because at the end of the day, it's that experience that matters, right? And I don't think there is ever going to be a right answer for this, except to say that it's going to be a journey. And we pretty much have started on that journey.
I think from an industry standpoint, I think it comes down to humility on the part of corporate actors, on the part of individuals or corporations, and just across the board. I think that in the past, platforms have moved so fast to own their space, to build products. They've also kept information, insights, and approaches in a silo. I think with humility and the recognition of the increase in volumes, the complexity of work that's headed our way, the risks that AI pose that need to be addressed, that humility to think that how do we really work across the board? How do we share information? How do we start to bridge the gap of what we understand is good for users and harmful to users, and be willing to share that across platforms? That humility is what's needed here.
And just so we get to the next question, I will say some standards look like Moses tablets, and they're dictated from the top. I believe in lowercase s, standards that are really enforceable codes of conduct. And so if you have a convener that has a leadership role to bring people together, they don't really care what noun is involved. They get towards a verb and they can reach consensus. And so that's where you need industry collaboration. And that is best done, I think, public-private partnership. That's the US model, but it can also be done just through industry consensus if there's enough leadership.
Yeah, I want to ask, India being with the supply of biggest data sets, maybe with 1.43 million population. So what are the policy decisions you would like to suggest when agentic AI comes into place more in usage in India? Yeah.
Was that directed to any one panelist? All of the above. What policy sets would you recommend to, what was the second bid?
In India, basically.
In India.
At scale, right?
Yeah.
So I think even with the scale that we're describing, there is an opportunity to create more consensus. And just to part of the discussion later today, Anand is joining me this afternoon. India has embraced the same industry consensus standards for moving health records over the internet. And so you have the US, India, many parts of Europe have embraced this FHIR API standard as a mechanism. So even the country is vast and diverse in terms of India's population and technical readiness. Okay. Sarala, that means to you. You get the last word. But anyway, that's how I see it.
Very well said. I think both of us will say a +1 to all.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you all for joining us.
The knockout blow, did we just knock out the panel with the ring? Thank you for moderating.
No, I appreciate it. No, thank you also to our wonderful hosts at the AI India Summit. It's been a pleasure.